Yeah, so let's do, this one's quite a nice simple one. It's got a sort of a good little field. Again, it's got quite a strong angling line, and some quite nice shapes that kind of jut up, and also a good sort of three value relationship. So we've got the mid-tone, roughly mid-tone of the yellow field, the wheat, sort of grassy field, I think it's wheat. The trees that are quite dark, and then the sky which is quite bright. So that gives us our sort of three basic values, and we've got some quite dominant lines. So again, I'm going to try to fit these into some different size boxes. So let's go with one that's going to be in this super wide box, another that will be in a kind of moderately tall box, and again maybe one in a square. So we'll do kind of these three and try to break it down. So I'll start with the super wide one. With the super wide, I probably would need to get pretty much the whole width of it, but I'm going to be cropping a lot up and down. So we then get this line of this field that slopes down, which separates the really dark tone from the field. Then if we're trying to simplify this sort of dark tone behind, we can maybe do that with a slightly more horizontal line, but then out of that just have a few little shapes that jut for those trees. And behind that, that's all pretty much like a fairly flat tone, the sky behind. So in that way you could probably simplify that into a reasonable little line drawing. If I go up into this box here, I'm inclined to always include this this tree shape here. It's got a nice sort of shape to it, the way it kind of pops up out of the landscape. It's got a nice level of contrast that sort of turns because it's lit on the right hand side quite strongly, and then the left hand side is quite shadowy. And there's a reasonable kind of a nice little bit of hillside in the distance that we can use to kind of enhance depth. So I'm going to include that. And for this one I'm going to set it so that that's quite low down in order to include the cloud shape above. The cloud shape above is quite nice because it's quite a heavy cloud that sits over the bright sky, so it adds this sort of fairly brooding aspect, which is nice. So again, put that same line there that angles across. Now that you've got a fair idea of what that image looks like, I'll just pan across and zoom in a little bit again. So we've got this line that drops down, and little tree there, the hillside in the distance, another line that angles back up, and then these two tree shapes. If I was being super accurate, I probably wouldn't, still in this shape, I wouldn't quite see the cloud. So you do have the option of, you could extend the shape up, so you can make it into a taller composition, or given the simplicity of the sky above the tree, and before it reaches that cloud, we could just drop, similar to how we move the rocks across, can just drop the cloud shape down a little bit, but keep its vertical alignments with the landscape the same. So it would sit somewhere like that, and it's got that little divot that cuts up into it. So I might leave it, for this one I'll just leave it for 2, so we'll look at these two compared to each other. So again, the first thing we want to do is just put a tone that separates the darker tones from the brighter sky. This isn't always the case, it very often is the case with landscapes that the sky is the brightest bit, and then the landscape is various types of darks. There are exceptions to that. But very often you'll find if the sky is in the image, the sky will probably have the lightest part. Some part of the sky will be the lightest part. So same for this one, we'll put a general tone over the trees in the field below. And we'll also put a dark tone in this one, we'll put a dark tone for the cloud because it's dark, quite heavy, that cloud. And that's just going to be our mid value. So I've now separated those two into a 2 value statement. So it's the light value of the sky and then the darker value of the landscape. Then the next thing to do would be to darken the tree line. So the tree line's much darker than the field. And the cloud, the bottom of the cloud is also a bit darker than the field as well, so we can darken that a bit. And then for this one, we just need a darker tone running along that tree line. So there, that's broken down the image into kind of gives us our 2 options in a clearer way, rather than just using the line drawing where we just see lines. We start to see tonally how it will mass, which is more like how the painting will look. And I would definitely, personally, I would be inclined to pick this one just because it's a little bit more, having that cloud above is a bit more interesting. I also probably think that although it's quite nice to have a wide angle image, this particular reference sort of benefits from having an upright composition, just because this tree kind of feels like it wants to go upright, whereas it feels sort of counter to the nature of the composition. If both of these images kind of focus in on this tree, or these 2 trees, this one feels like it's more natural to the shape and the sort of direction of the tree that the rest of the image around it is cropped in that way. So again, if I pick this one, I might start to develop it a little bit more. So I'll pan across and just zoom in. So to develop it, I can go in and now start to...
Can I ask a question, Kieran?
Yeah.
When you're zoning in on a particular part of the image, if you were doing it off a computer, would it be useful to sort of crop the image so that so that you're clear about where your sort of parameters are?
Yeah, if you were just working purely on a computer, definitely cropping makes a lot of sense.
And if you were outside, would you use frames? I mean, would you kind of...
outside, I use my eye. You can use frames. I'll go through, actually, the next thing I might do, because it's useful for all of the stages, but it's certainly something you can do in thumbnailing. I'll kind of talk through the process of isolating a section of an image in order to make it manageable. But yeah, working on the computer, like if I was working myself and not trying to kind of emulate what it's like working outdoors, I would definitely happily crop in and test stuff just by kind of cropping the image using tools. Phones are really good, like I said last week. If you've got a smartphone and you've got video editing, photo editing software on there, or apps, you can sort of mess around with cropping while you're out as well. So that's something you can do. It can work in tandem with thumbnail sketching, and it's similar to thumbnail sketching if you were to just take photos on your phone and then just crop into them. That's sort of what we're doing here, but with our eyes. So there's loads of stuff you can do, kind of hybridizing with technology. I don't ever see a problem with using technology with art. Traditionally, any new technology that came along, artists would always try out and use. So you don't have to do stuff with your eyes. It can be useful to, I think it's useful to do it because it just makes you sort of think about the landscape a bit more, sort of specifically when you're working with your eyes. Whereas when you take photos, we have an inclination to like take loads of photos and then you end up with almost too many. And having to sketch it and draw it slows you down a little bit and makes you think a bit more about what you're looking at. So it can be useful from that point of view. Yeah, so with this I would go in and then make a kind of secondary shadow into this tree, which is very dark. and then the trees on the right hand side of it, it's sort of slightly illuminated, so we've got this sense that the light's coming from the right hand side, and also the light's kind of striking at a fair slant, so it's obviously a sunset because you can feel that the light's coming quite strongly from the right hand side. Again, this sort of little shrub is pretty dark as well, and then that separates out from the landscape behind, and got this other little framing tree next to it as well. And I could soften it. It's a little bit sharp, those initial sort of lines around the clouds, so I can soften the clouds out a little bit too. And again, put a little bit of variation into the sky because there are clouds that are sort of streaking across, so it's created this sort of some light parts and some dark parts of the sky below as well. But something sort of at about that level is sufficient to kind of flesh out a very simple thumbnail. And does give you a reasonable sort of feel for how it might look if you kind of move into your tonal study. It's also useful for talking about the tonal sort of groupings. I could probably divide it into, this cloud tone is pretty similar to the kind of the trees in light. The trees in dark are a second dark tone, and then the value of the field is similar to the sort of lighter clouds. So that's sort of 1 value, 2, 3 in this section. That value is the same as this one. So it's only kind of really 3 values that we're working with. So moving that into the painting stage, you can then sort of, you've got some structure to kind of hang your initial value statements for whether you're doing like the, say the acrylic tonal we're doing is the next workshop, or when you're first starting out a color painting. With the color painting, you'd have to then factor in color, but you'd end up with the value of the kind of yellow field is going to be roughly the same as the kind of bluish clouds in the distance, and then the value of the sort of dark blue grey cloud is going to be a similar value to the trees in light. So you have these sort of, you'd end up with maybe 5 different color mixtures that you could start with. But it starts your brain thinking a bit about how you're going to structure the painting when you actually get going. So you're not sort of approaching the painting thinking, oh, there's all these, you know, all these different colors in the scene that you have to try to capture. You're starting to kind of figure out how you might structure your painting. So that's again where it's quite useful. So I'm going to try to find one that would be useful for talking about this cropping. This probably isn't a bad one actually. Actually, I might try to find one that's got a bit more contrast. Yeah, let's take this one for instance. So if I wanted to try to crop this into, let's say I want to crop it into this shape here, this box. So it's obviously the original photo is sort of horizontal. And imagining that I was there, so I'm there standing looking at all these trees. And I want to try to figure out how to fit it into this box. And so I could fit any part of the image into the box. I could just try to draw or paint just this tree. I could try to fit in the tree and the tree line behind it. I could try to just draw these trees here. But I am constrained by whatever the proportions are of the box that I'm putting it into. Obviously with these thumbnails we've got loads of different boxes, but let's say this was a canvas or a little panel that I had with me while I'm painting outdoors. I can't really change the proportions of it, so I have to try to fit this part of this image or part of what I'm looking at into this shape. And the best way to do it, I generally think, is figure out whether it's more important to you what you fit horizontally into the image or what you fit vertically into the image. So if you don't really care if the trees are cut off or this particular height of those trees, but you want to make sure you get all of these trees in, your starting point would be, where's your furthest left boundary? Where do you want to kind of put your left-hand boundary of the image, and where's your furthest right boundary? Once you've decided those two, you then sort of know what proportion your canvas is. So say I wanted to make it that wide, that would cut it into a square shape. So I'd have to have a lot of sky above or a lot of sort of land below. If I was working outdoors, that would be possible because anything's possible in terms of shapes. You can see everything. I'm obviously a bit limited with this photo. So let's say I wanted to fit this tree in, and I wanted to get maybe to about this point here on the image. So this just beyond this last little dark tree on the left-hand edge. So then my boundary would be just to the right of that tree and just to the left of this tree in the background. If I went all the way up the image, I would end up with a rectangle that I would say is a little bit taller than the rectangle that I'm looking at, which means I'd have to kind of crop in. One way you can do this is by taking a measurement. So if you were outdoors, you could hold your brush or your pencil in front of you and see if it's this wide. So you'd have to look at what your proportions are on your image first. So the image is about 1.5. So if this is 1, the height is 1.5. That's the ratio of the image, this little box that I've drawn. So the ratio is going to have to be the same, taking it from reality. So that would mean if I've got just inside the left-hand edge this little dark tree, and then just inside the right-hand edge that tilting tree, that would be that wide. So I'd go 1.5, which would put the top of the tree just about there. And the base of the tree, that taller tree, would be about here. And then that would be roughly the height of it. And then the land would drop down at that sort of angle relative to it. So it's not the sort of simplest thing to explain. It's always quite tricky to explain cutting in just with your eyes. But the general principle is you have to figure out what are the extents that you're looking for. So you know that you have to get this side of the image in, you have to get that side of the image in. So you start with the two extremes and you fill the middle in afterwards. And as I say, the sort of how much of the height you can get in once you've figured out the width is dependent on the shape that you're fitting it into. If I was trying to fit that same width into this rectangle, this square, I would then have to cut off, you can sort of see if this was a square shape, I'd have to cut off part of it in order for that to be a square composition, if that makes sense. It's slightly more complicated than some of the other things that we've talked about. So if I carry on with this one, having now cropped it in, we've got that tree shape, sort of almost like a sail shape that I've turned it into. And then the tree line behind, which sort of drops in a little bit lower than it. And we've got that little tree that I was using as the left-hand edge that sits about there. And then the landscape below, which should all be fairly dark. This little tree would be quite dark. Tree line behind would be dark in its simplest sort of version. And then this tree would also be kind of moderately dark. So that is a very simplified version of what we're looking at with that tree.